Hello everybody and welcome to History with Dr. Tom. So this is the first lecture in a series on the American Civil War era. We are going to be starting by looking at the causes of the American Civil War before we move into the war itself and its impact on American society. Now, when we talk about causes of the war, you cannot cram all of that into one single lecture. That is impossible. This video would be annoyingly long. So we're going to break it up into a series of small videos. This one is going to talk about the overview of the problem of sectionalism in the United States. Sectionalism is the primary cause of the American Civil War, and it is something that we need to hit upon very early in the sessions. Now, sectionalism. What is sectionalism? What sections were involved? That's key when understanding the American Civil War, of course. When does sectionalism begin, and what caused sectionalism? These are all questions you should have an answer to when we finish this whole series. So 1850 sectionalism, yes, that is when it's at its absolute worst before the war broke out, but it was not born in the 1850s. Its roots are planted long before that. So let's take a deeper look at sectionalism. So this map is a very good guide as to what sectionalism is, and also, of course, which regions are involved, North and South. Now, what is this sectionalism caused by? Well, there are several issues, but the main one is highlighted actually in that legend box on the bottom left. Notice that the southern states are all in that dark reddish color are slave states. That means that they legally allow the institution of slavery. It was up to individual states back then whether or not to have the institution of slavery, whether or not to authorize it. Similar to today, in the United States, it's up to the individual states to determine whether or not they have the death penalty. And if they have the death penalty, what method of execution to use. Now, back then, before 1865, it was up to individual states whether or not to allow slavery to legally exist within their borders. So those southern states there that you see in sort of rusty red, which there are 15 in total, all allow the institution of slavery. Slavery was what drove the southern economy before the Civil War. The North, on the other hand, did not allow slavery, therefore they're all called free states. The North, don't make a mistake and think that they're all, hugely in favor of equality between whites and blacks. They absolutely were not. Keep in mind, we're talking about the 19th century, not the 21st century. The vast majority of Northerners did not favor equality of whites and blacks. The vast majority of whites in the North in the 19th century were very racist by today's standards. That being said, we need to also understand the vast majority of Northerners, for some reason or another, and in some extreme or another, disagreed with the idea that a person should be able to own another person. So it's that principle that they are against. The North is driven entirely by free labor in the lead up to the American Civil War. That free labor could be viewed as wage slavery in some cases, for sure. So don't think the employment situation in the North was entirely ethical either. However, it was nothing like the institution of slavery itself. In the North, if you didn't like your job or didn't like your wage, you could quit. Now, you might struggle to find a job that pays you a wage that you feel comfortable with, that you can use to feed your family, etc., etc. But there was no institution of slavery in the North the way there was in the South. And that is going to create a great deal of sectionalism between these two sections of the United States. It's going to create a huge amount of arguments within the Senate, the House of Representatives, and even within the state legislatures regarding slavery. Now, when did sectionalism begin? That's a very good question. The dates here are very, very big. So 1777, that's when the first state in America abolishes slavery. That was Vermont, a northern state in New England. 1783, that's when America secured its independence officially from Great Britain. 1787, the year that the Constitution is drafted. 1808, the transatlantic slave trade ends. 1820, when the Missouri Compromise happens. 1831, when the abolitionist movement really gains a lot of momentum. 1846, War with Mexico. That had a lot to do with sectionalism as well. And then finally, 1850, when we get to the major compromise which happened that year. Historians argue that all of these events, all of these dates, played a huge role in sectionalism developing within the United States between the North and South. And I agree that all of them played crucial roles. Now, when does sectionalism become a problem that was going to more or less lead to a civil war sooner or later? That's something we will get to later in today's lecture. Now, let's first go back to the War of Independence, 1775 to 1783. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one northern state abolished slavery during the war. Other northern states were open to the idea of abolishing slavery within their borders during the war, and will start to do so very quickly after the war ends. What made a lot of Southerners quite angry, and some Northerners as well, was the fact that the British government promised to free slaves who would fight against the colonists who were rebelling against British rule. For example, Lord Dunsmore, the royal governor of Virginia, offered emancipation to any slave who would fight against the colonists. The same happened with the royal governor in New Jersey. These proclamations made American colonists furious, even stating in the Declaration of Independence that the king's representatives in the colonies were promoting insurrection against the slave owners, against the white colonists. This was all debated at when the Declaration of Independence was being pieced together by the founding fathers. It happened again in 1787 when the United States created the Constitution, which at that time did not directly refer to slavery. It did state that American citizens had the right to private property, and that the federal government would not have the authority to compensate your private property without due process of law and without justification, legal justification. A lot of Southerners saw that as protection of slavery because slaves at the end of the day were private property. That is what they were classed as, not as citizens of the newly created United States. So a lot of people point to the Constitution, the creation of the Constitution, as planting the seed for the American Civil War because it created an American Union which included both free states and slave states, and that debate about the future of slavery was already going on. But it's more than that. It's the fact that the Constitution did not directly refer to slavery. So that meant it was going to be an issue that we will continue to debate in the future years, which we most certainly did. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 is what I would say is the turning point in sectionalism, at which there is going to be no point of return. And it's only going to get worse from here. From this point, it's very likely that there will eventually be a civil war in the United States. And that is because Northerners and Southerners from this point are refusing to compromise. Now, what was a Missouri Compromise? Missouri was not a state in 1819. They were a territory. However, they wished to join the American Union formally as a state. That's tricky because at the time, there was an exact even number of slave states and free states. That's important because every state gets 2 senators representing them in Washington. And so if Missouri comes into the Union as a slave state, which it wants to do, that means there will be 2 more pro-slavery senators in Washington than pro-free state senators, anti-slavery. The Northerners were very insecure about that. They thought the South is going to have 2 up on us. We will not be even with them anymore. And therefore, they can dominate us politically. And they do not want this to happen. Senator James Tallmadge said, although the American Union intends to spread west in order to spread freedom and liberty, Senator Tallmadge, he's from New York, so northern state, proposed the Tallmadge Amendments, which would prevent any more slaves entering Missouri. Now, for the slaves who are already there, they would all be free once they turned 25 years old. So this is what we would call gradual abolition of slavery within the state of Missouri. Missouri does not want this. They absolutely want to be a slave state forever. That is their vision in 1819 when they're applying for statehood. Now, Senator Jesse Thomas of Illinois, another northern state, he proposed, yes, Missouri should come in as a slave state, but to maintain that balance between North and South, we will break up Massachusetts. The northern part of Massachusetts will be a new state called Maine, and it will enter the Union as a free state. That way, you would have two new states enter the Union. One would be a slave state, one would be a free state. Therefore, you would have two pro-slavery senators being added to the Senate, as well as two anti-slavery senators. Brilliant. We've maintained the balance. We've stopped a war from breaking out. Yeah, for now. The Missouri Compromise line was also created as a result of the Missouri Compromise. This is the 3630 parallels, it's also called. And what the rule is that although Missouri is above that established Missouri Compromise line, that will be the only state allowed to enter the Union from this point forward that can have slavery. So any new state that enters the Union above the Missouri Compromise line will have to enter as a free state. Now, some Southerners immediately realized this is not good. If you look at that map there, look at where the Missouri Compromise line is. This is the line between Missouri and Arkansas. And with that, look at all the territory north of that. Look at the territory south of it. At that point, almost all the territory south of it actually was Mexico, not United States territory, whereas all that Minnesota territory, the unorganized territory, Oregon territory, that's all American territory. So there's a lot more room for free states to enter the Union than slave states. American South politicians understand that, and they immediately panic. Now, there is also going to be a rule to get the Southerners on board with this compromise. They make a proposal that all slaves will be 3/5 of an American citizen. It's what we call the 3/5 clause. And the point of this is that it would raise the population, the overall population of citizenry within each state. Therefore, that would increase the number of electoral points for future presidential elections. It would increase the number of representatives in the House of Representatives that each state will have in the South. So the South does say, okay, they don't like the Missouri Compromise, but they're willing to go along with it. The North also does not like it because they don't like the idea of even one single new slave state entering the Union, which Missouri is going to be exactly that. So they don't like it. Neither side, North or South, likes Missouri Compromise, but they will both agree to it in the end, just barely. And almost every Southern senator ended up voting for it. Almost every Northern senator voted against it. So we've got a real divide there, and it took just a couple of Northern senators who voted in favor of it that got it to pass. So Missouri does formally enter the Union in 1821 as a slave state. Maine formally enters the Union in 1821 as a free state. And so now let's look at what sectionalism looks like on the ground. This is a photograph of a plantation in Virginia, Shirley Plantation. And this is a tobacco plantation. It is a colonial era plantation right on the James River in Virginia, which you can see directly behind it. And that is a classic example of what agriculture has done in the American South, plantation agriculture. And that has caused the American South to immediately realize they can get rich off plantation agriculture. They can get rich, therefore, off slave labor. Slave labor is going to be the machinery which will drive the Southern economy. It will spread further south and west in new Southern states, such as Mississippi. This is Dunlea's plantation in Natchez, Mississippi, which was a cotton plantation. Cotton made more money than tobacco, and tobacco made a lot of money. So slavery was something that with a lot of people, especially in the South, but also some people in the North as well, saw slavery as something that was very positive for the American economy. And in fact, by the time we get to the eve of the American Civil War, cotton is going to be more than half of the U.S. exports leaving the country. Therefore, will be driving the income from more than half of all American exports on the eve of the Civil War. So you could say that slavery was vital to the American economy before the Civil War broke out. But it came at a cost, suffering of millions of African Americans. So you see this plantation, you see the slave hut in the background. They lived in very different quarters from their masters, and you can see the slaves there going out into the cotton fields early in the morning, picking cotton, loading up bales. In the background, you can see the wagon carrying the picked cotton. It's going to take it to the cotton gins, where they will rip all the seeds out of all the cotton bolls, and then it will be put on trains. And again, in the far background, you can see a steam train pulling a train full of bales of cotton to the ports of Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans, and Galveston, Texas. Cotton is very much driving the Southern economy and also largely the American economy. The North was very different. The North was very industrial. The North had nearly every shipyard. It had a lot more railroad mileage than the South, and railroads were being developed at a much faster pace in the North. You had a lot of machinery being imported to the North, exported from the North to Europe and other regions of the world. And of course, the North is very agricultural, but they're also making a lot of money selling their corn and wheat abroad, selling it from state to state, etc., etc. So the North is also generating a lot of industry, industrial wealth, but also agricultural wealth. Not as much as the South is agriculturally, but the North is industrializing. Look at all these steamships coming in. There are great harbors in the North, which are helping drive the Industrial Revolution up there. There's very little industrial activity going on in the South in comparison. Factories are almost exclusively in the North. That's going to be a big problem when this war breaks out, when the South doesn't have many cannon factories. The North has the vast majority of them. But it wasn't just weapons factories. Every type of factory was in the North. You had hardly any at all in the South. And the North and South were clearly becoming two very distinct regions, two very, very different cultures altogether. In a lot of ways, you could say two completely different nations, but they are all in the same nation, the United States. But that is part of why this is going to lead to a civil war, when the South is going to try to break away from their industrial counterparts in the North. Well, that is the end of the first lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have liked it, if you can click the like button at the end of this video, and I hope you'll also subscribe to my channel, and we'll move on to the next one, move on to other aspects of the causes of the American Civil War. We'll be looking at the abolitionist movement and slave insurrections next. See you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.